All right, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing the concept of liens, which is a form of money encumbrances. Actually, liens means money encumbrances. An encumbrance is anything that burdens or limits the title to property. And if the property is security for a debt or an obligation to pay money, it's called a lien. So what we're covering is what we know the California Department of Real Estate wants you to know in order to pass the real estate licensing exam. So let's go through this. A lien is a charge, like a charge card, where somebody is charged because they owe money, and it is security or collateral for the payment of a debt. A charge imposed upon the property where the property is security for the payment of the debt. The Department of Real Estate has asked, who controls lien laws? Who controls laws that attach property because of a lawsuit or something like that? And the choices include, who is it the federal government? Is it the state government? And the one that it is not, because actually the way the question is worded, which of the following do not regulate lien laws? And its answer is cities and counties. The state of California, the federal government regulates liens, but cities and counties do not control liens. Deed restrictions are not liens. One of the more common questions on the state exam. A deed restriction or a zoning law is another example, are encumbrances in that they restrict or burden the title to property, but they are not liens. And that's because there's no debt or obligation to pay money. All liens are encumbrances, but not all encumbrances are liens. Now, the Department of Real Estate is keen that you know the difference between general and specific, involuntary and involuntary. If the lien is specific, it means it's on a particular parcel, maybe more than one. If it is a general lien, it's on any and all property of the owner in the county where it is recorded. All liens are encumbrances, right? But not all encumbrances are liens. So here are the common types of liens that the Department of Real Estate is likely to ask about. And breaking it down, is it general or specific? If it's voluntary or involuntary, you can see most liens are not voluntary. Property taxes, I don't recall volunteering to pay property taxes, right? It's involuntary and it's specific in that if I don't pay my property taxes, it only affects the parcel that I didn't pay the taxes on. If for some reason it isn't worth the amount that I owe, they can't go get other parcels and lien them or take them or sell them because it's a specific lien. The mechanics lien, which we'll talk about later, is when you don't pay a contractor, they can lien the property that they perform to work on, but they can't lien other property that you own. It's not voluntary. Judgments, which would be, let's say you have a business and the business fails and your business partners sue you and they get a judgment against you, the judgment is a general lien. It doesn't specify which parcels it's on. One way to look at it is specific liens are against properties, but general liens are against persons. So that would be for anything they could find of yours. And of course, not voluntary. Income tax is a form of a judgment lien. You understand it's a general lien. If you don't pay, if you owe $1 million to the IRS and they get a judgment against you, the judgment isn't going to say, well, they could take this house, but they can't take that house. They could take this car, but they can't take that. It's not what it says. They can take anything they can find in order to pay the judgment. And what we're going to spend most of our time on tonight are mortgages and trustees, which are specific. That's when you borrow money against a property. And as you can see, they're the ones that are voluntary. Voluntary, trust deeds and mortgages. Well, it sort of defines itself. A voluntary lien is where you volunteer your property, usually to get a loan. And a promissory note would also be used, which we're going to talk a little bit about. The note is evidence that you owe money. So another way of categorizing this subject is that they are finance documents. And there are three major finance documents that the Department of Real Estate is going to ask you questions about. Trust deeds, and by the way, in California, the most common loan involves a trust deed. Mortgages, which are very rare, and land contracts, which are, well, even more rare. So a trust deed or a mortgage, it's an instrument. And when you see the word instrument, it means a piece of paper that has a legal effect, and it secures payment of the note. So there's two parts. There's the note, which is an obligation to pay money, and then there's the mortgage or the trust deed. It being the trust deed or mortgage encumbers the property. The note does not encumber the property. I sign an IOU. I promise to pay you back $800,000. I give it to you. That does not put a lien on my property. But if I sign the note and then sign a mortgage, the mortgage is the thing that liens the property. Trust deeds usually don't have street addresses, only a legal description, just a question that was on the state exam. And here is a diagram, which you should become familiar with if you're taking the state exam, and it's about mortgages and trust deeds. Let's start with the categories over here. We have a borrower, the lender, evidence that you owe money, security, and a release once you paid it off. Now, the borrower in a mortgage is called the, and that should be OR, I have to change that, mortgagor. I can't imagine that how I let that slip, but it's a mortgagor, and the lender is a mortgagee. Now, sometimes people have trouble with this, mortgagor versus mortgagee. And the Department of Real Estate has realized that more people mix up the borrower and the lender in a mortgage than they do, well, in other places. In other words, in the OR and EE words, the lessor versus lessee. Most people understand that. The grantor and the grantee, the offeror, the offeree, the vendor, the vendee, transferor, transferee. Most of that is pretty straightforward. But mortgagor and mortgagee sometimes causes difficulty. And I have a theory as to why. Because I've been doing this for a long time, and I've noticed that a lot of people about to take the state exam have them switched in their head, where they think the mortgagee is the borrower and the mortgagor is the lender. And my theory as to why has to do with just the sound of the names. When you're little and they call you, let's say your name is Mike, but they call you Mikey, right? They add that E sound to the end of your name. That makes it sound like a baby's name, right? And you reach a certain age and you don't want to be called Mikey anymore, right? You want to be called Mike or Michael or something like that. Now, we all intuitively know who in this relationship has the most power, and it's the lender. So I think there's a natural assumption that the lender is going to have the strong name, mortgagor, right? That's a good, strong name. Mortgagee, I mean, it just sounds so weak. And we know the lender is not weak. But the OR and EE words have nothing to do with weakness, but they have more to do with movement. So the mortgagor OR words refer to the owner of what we're talking about. So the owner of the property that the money is being borrowed against is the borrower's money. That's the mortgagor. The mortgagor is the owner of the property and gives the mortgage to the mortgagee, the lender, and the EE word denotes somebody who's received it. OR is the owner, EE is the receiver. The Department of Real Estate often on their exams ask questions about mortgagors and mortgagees. Not because anybody uses that term in the real world anymore, we don't, right? Because we just don't. But they use it because they know that people are more likely to mess it up, to flip it around, and therefore miss the question, which is really what their goal is. The evidence of the debt is called a mortgage note. That's an IOU. The security is a mortgage contract. What's kind of strange about a mortgage is that the note is also called a promissory note. So the note is a promise to pay back a debt. But the security for the note is a contract. And a contract is a promise that the law will enforce. So it's a little strange here is you have a promise being secured by another promise. And there are two different promises. The first promise is, I agree to pay back the $800,000 I borrowed. The second promise is, I'll give up the house if I don't. And the release of a mortgage is called a certificate of discharge. Now, if we're looking at trust deeds, which are in fact the most common method of financing real estate, if the borrower in a mortgage is called the mortgagor, then the borrower in the trust deed is probably called the trustor. If the lender in the mortgage is called the mortgagee, then the lender in the trust deed should be, well, beneficiary? Well, wait a second. If there's a trustor, there's got to be a trustee. Isn't that the way those OR and EE? I mean, if there's an OR word, there's got to be an EE word that sounds like it. Well, if the lender is not the trustee, then who is the trustee? And the answer is they're a third party that have been given legal title with the power of sale. Think of it like borrowing money on a car. You have to give up your pink slip to the lender. You give up your legal title with the power of sale. Because if you stop making payments for a few months, they're going to send two guys at midnight to get the car. And then once they got the car and they have your pink slip, they can sell the car. Now, when you pay off your car loan, what do you want from the lender? Answer, of course, is you want your pink slip back. So if you give up your legal title in a house loan, in order to get it, you want your title back. And that is called the deed of reconveyance. If you don't pay off your loan, then it'll be sold at an auction. And the highest bidder at the auction gets something called a trustee's deed. So in a trust deed, the borrower is the trustor, the lender is called the beneficiary, the trustee is a third party that's holding on to the title, the debt evidence is still a note, but the security is not a contract. It's not a promise to do something in the future. You've already given up the pink slip. And the release is called this deed of reconveyance. There are almost no mortgages in California. I mean, literally, virtually none. Every once in a while, somebody, usually in LA County, will pick a year or something like that and go through, right, electronically, I imagine, all of the liens that were recorded that year, looking for how many of them are trust deeds and how many of them are mortgages. And usually they find something like 10, 15 mortgages out of millions of loans. The rest are all trust deeds. But wait a second. We call them mortgage companies. Isn't that what we call them? And you could get a MLO, that's a designation from the Department of Real Estate to be a loan agent, which is called a mortgage loan originator. And then the Department of Real Estate has a form they want loan agents in California to fill out when they're making a loan on residential 1 to 4 unit property, and it's called a mortgage loan disclosure statement. So if what I'm saying is true, that there are almost no mortgages, they're all trust deeds, then why do we call them mortgage companies and mortgage loan originators? And doesn't the Department of Real Estate know that we're a trust deed state? And the answer is, well, they know. But the reason we still use the word mortgage, because it's a word people understand. A lot of people may not understand what it means to trust deed their house, but they do understand usually what it means to mortgage their house. They do understand that. And if we looked at the words, just because we're bored, I guess, the word mortgage is comprised of two Latin words. The word mort, I think that was the name of the guy who thought of it. Or it's a Latin word that means dead. How about that? And then there's the word gage, G-A-G-E, which is another word that means to pledge. It's actually a French word that means to pledge. And another word for pledge, the English word for pledge, was pawn, which is a word we might be more familiar with, right? If you watch the TV show about the pawnbrokers and things like that. So when you go into a pawn shop, you have to give up possession of whatever it is that you're using as security. That's called pledging. In a mortgage, the pledge is dead, in that a mortgage is a way in which you can borrow money against something, but not give up possession of it. So the word mortgage just means borrowing money against something without giving up possession of it. In that context, a trust deed is a form of mortgage. You understand? It's a type of mortgage, because in the trust deed, you borrow money on something without giving up possession of it. Now, the reason that this can become a challenge when you're taking the real estate exam is that when the Department of Real Estate is asking a question and they're using the word mortgage, are they talking about loans in general, or are they talking about a very specific type of loan that we're talking about? Well, now, right? Or are they talking about that? All right. Now, in the mortgage contract, there are two parties. The mortgagor is the borrower. The mortgagee is the lender. When payment is paid in full, you get a certificate of discharge. If there's a default, it can be foreclosed only through the courts. Remember, a true mortgage, this is why, by the way, lenders don't use mortgages, because in order to foreclose a mortgage, you have to go to court. And it's, as you're going to see, it takes a long time. Remember, the mortgage, which has a mortgage contract, the contract is simply a promise that the law will enforce. So you say, I'll give up my house if I can't pay back the loan. You don't pay back the loan, you don't give up your house, they'll take you to court. It's the only way to foreclose. If it's a trustee, there are three parties: the trustor, the beneficiary, and the trustee. The trustor is the borrower, the beneficiary is the lender, and the trustee is a third party. Sometimes people ask me, who are trustees? How do you become one? Like, maybe this is a career path. Well, trustees are generally subsidiaries of whoever your lender is. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, credit unions, they got their own, right? That's usually a subsidiary of the company that owns the bank, but title companies and others can be trustees. Payment in full. This is the trust deed. There's something called a request for full reconveyance. That's once the loan has been paid off. The trustee are sent to the trustee by the beneficiary. That's telling the trustee to do that, to reconvey. The trustee signs a reconveyance deed. The reconveyance deed does not convey title to a new buyer. So this is a question that's been on the state exam. The reconveyance deed, or the deed of reconveyance, does not convey title to a new buyer. It gives back the title to the original borrower once they paid off the loan. This, by the way, comes up in real estate. Let's say you're selling a house, and the house you're selling, the seller has a loan on it already, right? The seller has a loan on it, but the house is for sale. This is the sequence of events that must occur in order for the transaction to be completed. Step one, the buyer's money has to go into escrow. Once the buyer's money is into escrow, step two, some of that money is used to pay off the seller's loan. Once the seller's loan has been paid off, step three, is that the trustee for the lender on the seller's loan will issue a deed of reconveyance, giving title back to the original borrower, to the owner of the property. Again, think of the car loan. You can't sell the car unless you get your pink slip back. They won't give you your pink slip back until you're paying off the loan. Same thing is true. So we have buyer's money in, seller's loan paid off, trustee gives back the legal title, the pink slip, through the deed of reconveyance, and then finally step 4, the seller can convey the title to the buyer. They can't do it until they get their title back, and they won't get their title back until it's paid off. And by the way, the reconveyance fee, or the deed of reconveyance fee, appears on the seller's net sheet. I've actually had clients point at it and say, what is that? Can you imagine you're representing a seller, $1 million property, and the seller is looking at, it's usually a few $100s, they're looking at their closing costs, and they see this reconveyance fee. And they ask you as their agent, what is this? What are you going to say? I mean, you could just say, I don't know. It's a fee. You got to pay. I don't know what it is. Hey, look at my commission. Look at that. Isn't that great? See how much money I'm getting? Should a real estate agent be familiar with the common fees that appear on escrow closing statements? I would vote yes to that. You have 30 calendar days after the loan is paid off to do it. Now, that may seem like a really long time because, hey, we're selling the house and gee, don't we need it right away? And the request for full reconveyance has to be done. And then within 21 days, it has to have the trustee must sign in and record the reconveyance deed. Now, there are 2 kinds of loans. There are loans to purchase real estate. And then there are loans against property you already own. So if you're selling your house and you have a loan on it, the deed of reconveyance is issued really, really quickly. I mean, we're talking minutes. As soon as the lender gets their money, they issue the deed of reconveyance because we need the pink slip in order to sell the house. But let's say you've owned the house for 30 years. And you finally made your last payment. You want your pink slip back. That's when these timelines kick in because they're not in such a big hurry, right? Not in such a big hurry. They usually don't take that long, but basically it's illegal if they don't do it within that time frame. What happens if you don't pay off a trust deed? Beneficiaries can choose. They get a choice in the trust deed. They could go with a trustee sale, which is quick and doesn't take very long, about 4 months, or they could go through the courts I'll explain why you might want to go through the courts. If they go through the courts, the court foreclosure rules would apply. What are those rules? This is the sequence as you might need to know for the state exam. And by the way, California law says, whether it's a trust deed or mortgage, and this hasn't been on the test yet, but it may never be, but California law says for either a mortgage or a trust deed, the lender cannot begin the foreclosure process until the borrower is 3 months delinquent. 3 months. So somebody hasn't made their payment for 3 months. The mortgagee, which is the lender, hires a lawyer. They file a complaint. They have a hearing. The court orders the property sold. Then a notice of sale is published. They nail a copy to your door and record it once a week for 3 weeks. Then there's, at the end of the 3 weeks, an auction. And the highest bidder gets something called a certificate of sale. Notice that's not a deed. It's not a deed. So first of all, how long could all this take? 3 months in order to start the process. Then you have to have a court hearing. How long would it take to get a court hearing today if you just started like tomorrow? And the answer is it could take a really long time. Many months, many months it could take. So then they have the auction, and the highest bidder doesn't get a deed. They basically get a piece of paper that says, congratulations, right? Congratulations, you were the highest bidder. The mortgagor, that's the borrower, has 1 year to redeem. That means the borrower, after all of this is over, gets to stay in the property for 1 more year in order to try to raise money in order to pay off the loan. If they can't, after a year, a sheriff's deed is issued. This is why lenders don't use mortgages. This is why we almost never go to judicial foreclosure. How long would all of this take? And by the way, that 1 year right of redemption was a law that was passed in California back in the Great Depression days, where they wanted to make it difficult for lenders to foreclose on people. So they found another way. Instead of going to court, they use what's called a trustee sale. Again, they have to wait 3 months. But 3 months, you miss 3 months of payments, the beneficiary is going to notify the trustee. The trustee records something called a notice of default. In the business, we sometimes call an NOD, right? You'll see real estate agents, real estate people talking about an NOD, that's a notice of default. The trustee waits 3 months. So 3 months before you can begin the process, 3 months waiting after the notice of default. And then there's a notice of sale, which is advertised for 3 weeks. So how long does this take? Well, not counting the 3 months you have to wait to begin the process, this could be done in 4 months, right? 3 months after the notice of default, 3 weeks after the notice of sale. The trustor can reinstate. Reinstate means pay up as opposed to pay off. So if you, within 5 days of the trustee sale, make up all the back payments and the penalties, you win the lottery or rich relatives gives you money, it'll stop the foreclosure. The last 5 days, you got to wire all of the money to the lender. Assuming that doesn't happen, the trustee conducts a sale and issues what's called a trustee's deed to the highest bidder. Till that happens, the trustor owns the property. Now, I oftentimes have agents and potential clients who say, you know, I hear that buying foreclosure properties, buying distressed properties, easy way to make a killing. This will be great. You know, I'm going to do it. There's some pitfalls. So this, first of all, it's kind of complex and maddening at times to figure out what's going on. But we have a notice of default. There's a notice of sale. Then there's supposed to be an auction. Now, we being real estate agents, generally have access to software where we can track all these things. I could send you a list of all the notices of default that have been recorded in whatever time period you wanted, pretty much, in anywhere, pretty much in California, right? Pretty anywhere. So now you know that a certain property is in default, and it'll tell you when the auction is. What is kind of confusing is a lot of times the auction is never held. Right? They don't say why. It just doesn't get held. Sometimes it's postponed. They talk the lender into giving them more time. Sometimes it gets canceled without, you don't really know why. Sometimes it is sold to, sometimes there's an auction. So where it's sold to the bank or sold to a third party, that's when you have an auction. Now, what makes these a little bit risky to buy is that unlike other normal, I'll call them sales, you could have a termite report done. If you're buying a property, you could have a property inspection done. You could read a preliminary title report to see if there's any judgments and things like that. In trustee sales, you don't get any of that stuff. There's no property inspection, there's no termite inspection, there's no seller transfer disclosure statement, there's nothing. You get to see the property the day that the auction is. Usually that's it. You can go look at the property. All right, highest bid. Who wants to make the highest bid? Right. And so it can be dangerous. Sometimes sellers, when they know they're losing the property, will, let's say, leave little gifts behind. They'll pour cement down the drains and in the toilets and things like that, so it all hardens. There's some risk. Now, if they conduct the sale, obviously postpone means no sale, canceled means there is no sale. But if they do have a sale, it could either be sold to the bank or sold to a third party. When it's sold to the bank, that's when we call something an REO. REO stands for real estate owned by the bank. This is how that would happen. Let's say $800,000 is the outstanding balance of the loan. The opening bid at the auction is the amount of the first loan plus any costs of sale. That's the opening bid. Let's say that's 800,000. What happens if nobody wants to build 800,000? They look to the lender and they say, what do you want to do? And one of the options the lender has is, we'll take the property. If the lender wanted to, the lender could say, well, see what you can get, right? See how much people will pay. But the lender has the right to take the property if there isn't a bid sufficiently high to pay off their loan. If somebody says, I'll bid $1 million, I want 900,000, which is above the amount of the first of the costs of sale, and they're the highest bidder, then it's sold to a third party. The trustee's deed would be used in either case to transfer the title. Priority of payments, they pay the cost, they pay the fees, they pay the expenses, they pay any outstanding taxes, they pay trust deeds, mortgages, mechanics, liens, in order of priority, which we're going to get to in a moment. And if there's money left over, well, you've done it wrong if you're the borrower, right? Because if there's money left over, why didn't you sell it in the 4 months that it was on, in the foreclosure process so that this didn't happen? Right now, back in 2008 and 2009, when the market crashed, one of the problems is that a lot of people in the run up to that period were buying property with 100% financing. There was no equity. So a lot of times the properties weren't worth the amount of the first and the cost of sale. That's not the way loans are today. Most people that have a loan have sufficient equity that they could sell the property, pay off the loans, and have some money left over. Then there's something called the doctrine of relation back. Title of a successful bidder at the trustee sale relates in time, back in time to when they executed the mortgage. I have an example. Let's look at the example. So this is a timeline, right? This is a timeline. Let's say I'm buying a house. So I get a first trust deed to buy the house. I want to put in the swimming pool. So I get a second loan on the property in order to have some money to pay for the swimming pool. Work begins on the swimming pool. I then, a few weeks later, get this strange notice in the mail, nailed to my door, recorded on the property. It's called a lis pendens. And the word lis means lawsuit, and the word pendens means pending. A lis pendens is a notice of a pending lawsuit. Now, it's not just that I'm being sued, right? It's that whoever is suing me is making a claim on the house itself. They want my house. So given that, I've decided I'm not going to make payments on the first or the second or the pool contractor until if I realize if I'm going to be able to keep the house or not. I lose in court. And a abstract, which is a summary of the judgment against me, is recorded at this point in time. Later, the pool contractor is tired of me not returning his phone calls, and he files a mechanics lien on my property. And then finally, there's a trustee sale. The holder of the first, who's also gotten tired of being ignored, conducts a trustee sale on the first. The question is, if you were buying the property at the trustee sale, would you be taking title subject to the mechanics lien, the judgment, and the second? And the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is that the trustee's deed is said to relate back in time to when the first trust deed was given. When the first trust deed was made, there was no second. Work had not begun on a swimming pool. There was no notice of a lawsuit, no judgment, no mechanics lien. When do mechanics liens take effect? And the answer is the day the work began. When do judgments take effect? The answer is the day they recorded the notice of the pending lawsuit. Can you see why this is called the doctrine of relation back? Now, let's say at this point in the timeline, I go to the lender and I say, look, this is really bad. I'm on the ropes. There's obviously no way I'm ever going to get out of this. Why don't I just give you the property? I'll just deed you the property in lieu of you foreclosing on me. How about that? Now, in this case, the lender would be unlikely to accept that deed in lieu of foreclosure. And that's because a deed is effective when it's delivered. A deed is effective when it's delivered. So if the lender were to accept the deed in lieu of foreclosure, they would be taking title subject to the mechanics lien, the judgment, and the second. Deficiency judgments. Under limited circumstances, a lender may get a judgment against the borrower if the property is sold at foreclosure for less than what is owed. But it is not possible in a trustee sale. And it is not possible if it's a purchase money loan. All right. A purchase money loan is either where the seller extends credit, sometimes referred to as soft money, or buying 4 or less owner-occupied residential units. Purchase. Let's say we have a house for sale, $800,000, and there are 2 potential buyers. You're the loan agent. Buyer number 1 comes to you. Buyer number 1 says, I'd like to buy that $800,000 house. I have 20% down. 20% down is $160,000. I got the 20% down. So they would need a $640,000 loan. All right. But buyer number 1 also owns another property worth $1.2 million. And the buyer owns that property free and clear. So you're a lender that's going to make a $640,000. First of all, would you lend, assuming no credit issues, would you lend buyer number 1 $640,000? Most people would say, yeah, I'd lend them $640,000. What would you want as the security for that loan? The answer is, I'd rather have the $1.2 million property. So if the buyer had gave you a mortgage or a trust deed on a $1.2 million property, you'd give them the $640,000 loan. How could you lose, right? Do you really care what the buyer is going to do with that money? Do you care if the buyer really uses it to buy another house, or maybe they've been studying video poker, and they got a new system and they want to go to Vegas and own a casino by bankrupt? Do you really care? Probably not. Right? Not if they give you a $1.2 million house as security. You probably don't care. In fact, if they came in with their suitcase and said, I need the $640,000, I'm going to Vegas, can you put it in, you'd hand the money in the suitcase and you'd wait as they drove away. That's buyer number 1. Buyer number 2 also would like to buy that house. Buyer number 2 has the 20% down, $160,000. But that's it. The buyer number 2 does not own a house. But by the way, buyer number 2 has a good job, which buyer number 2 has had for a long time. Buyer number 2 makes enough money that buyer number 2 is likely to be able to make the mortgage payment. Buyer number 2 also has a really good credit score. Good job, good income, good credit score. Would you lend buyer number 2 the money to buy the house? hope the answer is yes. Otherwise, don't be a loan agent. I hope the answer is yes. But now the question is, what do you want as security for that loan? And the answer, of course, is you would want the house that the buyer was buying. So buyer number one isn't necessarily getting a loan on the house they're buying. Right? They're just getting a loan on a house they already own. Buyer number two is getting a loan on the house they're buying. That's a purchase money loan. A purchase money loan is a loan to buy property secured by the property being bought. It's a purchase money loan. Now, what does this have to do with deficiencies? All right, let's say the market crashes and that $800,000 house is no longer worth $800,000, it's only worth $550,000. That means if the house is sold at an auction, there's going to be a $90,000 deficiency. That's the deficiency we're talking about. Now, under California law, if the property is a 1 to 4 unit, residential property, owner occupied, and the loan is a purchase money loan, the lender cannot get a deficiency judgment. Again, this is a law that was passed in the 1920s and 30s, something like that. I forget what year. I wasn't there. But it was passed during the Great Depression. And I know you're going to probably find this hard to believe, right? You're going to find this hard to believe. But what was happening is lenders were lending people more money than the lender actually believed the property was worth. Sounds crazy. Because what would happen is when the borrower defaulted, the lender would not only take the house, but take their business, take a farm, take other things as well. I know you're going to find that hard to believe that lenders would do something like that. So what California said was, who's the sophisticate in this transaction? Is it the borrower, or is it Bank of America? And so what they said is probably Bank of America knows more about what's going on than the typical 1 to 4 unit owner occupied buyer. So if Bank of America lends you more money to buy a house than the house turns out to be worth, Bank of America cannot sue you and collect the deficiency. They can take the house, but they can't sue you to take the deficiency. Buyer number one, however, is in a different position because buyer number one did not get a loan secured by the house that was being bought. Buyer number one got a loan against property that buyer number one already owned. And so the law presumes that buyer number one knows more about that house than Bank of America. Buyer number one can hear the foundation creaking, right? See the cracks appearing in the foundation, hear the gurgling of the underground stream every time it rains. And the buyer number one, the lender could get a deficiency judgment against buyer number one, but not against buyer number two, because that one is a purchase money loan. Now, if I haven't worn you out yet on purchase money loans, let's look at the diagram. So if it's a purchase money loan, notice there's more boxes because you have a lender who funds the loan, the seller who conveys the title to the borrower who then can give the security to the lender, and the lender has a lien. You understand in that sequence, the first thing that has to happen in buyer number two is the lender's got to put money in escrow because buyer number two doesn't own anything. And buyer number two won't own anything until the seller conveys the title, which the seller is not going to do until the seller's been paid. So once the lender funds and the seller is paid, then the borrower gets the deed, which makes their mortgage or trustee defective, and the lender now has a lien. But buyer number one, not as many boxes. It's just a kind of a two-way thing. You have a borrower and you have a lender, right? The borrower gives the security, then the lender funds the loan and has a lien, and the borrower has the money. Deficiency judgment is a deficiency judgment is not possible if the fair market value exceeds the amount of a loan. It isn't necessarily what the highest bid is that determines whether there's a deficiency. It's simply what the property is worth. Because remember, in the other chart, the lender always had the right to take the property. A deficiency judgment is possible only if the property is foreclosed by court. Remember, it's called a judgment. And in order to get a judgment, well, you need a judge. And to get a judge, you got to go to court. And the loan is not a purchase money loan. It has to be a loan against property you already own, or a loan not 1 to 4 units owner occupied. Flippers, like house flippers, not protected. Not protected. All right, trust deed and mortgage. I'd like to make this, it's a big chart, but anyhow, the trust deed, I'm gonna make it smaller in the future. Trust deeds and mortgages, the lender's right. If it's foreclosed by a court action, the trust deed is the same as a mortgage. In other words, the lender in a trust deed, because they have a note, remember the note? The note says, I promise to pay back 800,000. So the lender in the trust deed is given a choice. They could either do a trustee sale, but there's no deficiency judgment. Or if they felt there was a big deficiency and it was a kind of loan that wasn't exempt, they could go to court, right? The only reason you would go to court on a trust deed is because you want a deficiency judgment. Mortgages, there's a possible deficiency judgment. Owner's rights of redemption sort of goes down to another page. The owner's rights of a redemption, if it's foreclosed by court action, it's the same as a mortgage. You got that 1 year right of redemption. If it's a mortgage, before the decree of foreclosure, you can redeem by making the payments current. After the decree of foreclosure, you have the 1 year equity or right of redemption. And I've already gone through the trustee sale. You can redeem within 3 months. You can redeem after the notice of sale by paying in full. And the statute of limitations, a trust deed, a trust note outlaws, but this is a common question on the state exam. The trust deed does not have a statute of limitations because it's a deed, but a mortgage is a contract and they outlaw 4 years from the due date. I'd just like to know. General notes. The trust deed or mortgage is a mere incident of the debt. This is just an annoying question that's been on the state exam. Incidental. What's that mean? You know? So we have a dog, and the dog has a tail. Which is incidental? The dog or the tail? Probably the tail. I mean, you could have a dog without a tail, but it's harder to have a dog's tail without ever having had a dog. Could you have a note without a mortgage or trust deed? The answer is sure. It's an IOU. I promise to pay you back the $100,000 you lent me. Could you enforce the note without a mortgage or trust deed? The answer is yes. You could enforce it. How would you do that? You'd hire a lawyer, go to court, say, hey, he owes me $100,000 and he's not paying me. The judge says, can you prove that he owes you the money? Yes, here it is. Here's the note. I got it. He signed it, but he's not paying me. The judge could issue a judgment in my favor if I'm the plaintiff, which I could use to lien and sell the property. We're going to talk about judgments later. So you could have a note without having a mortgage or trust deed. Can you have a mortgage or trust deed without ever having had a note? Do you think the law would allow you to foreclose on somebody's property if you couldn't prove that they actually owed you money? So which is incidental? The mortgage or trust deed is incidental to the note. You could enforce a note without a trust deed, but you can't enforce a trust deed without a note. But then one of them being create a presumption that the other exists. I mean, if I'm walking down the street and I happen to see a dog's tail, that's probably evidence that somewhere there's a dog. I mean, you know. And so the court might say, well, yeah, we don't have the note, but why did you sign the mortgage if you don't owe any money? I don't know. But the trust deed or mortgage is incidental. The trust deed or mortgage is recorded. The note is not. Why not? And that's because you can only record documents with one exception, which we cover in business opportunities. You can only record documents that affect the title to or possession of real property, and the note by itself does not do that. The promissory note is not a lien. It's not a lien, right? It doesn't lien the property. It's simply evidence that somebody owes money. It's the mortgage or trust deed that creates a lien, and that's what's recorded. If there's a conflict between the note and the trust deed, the note is the boss. The use of another note as security for another note is called a pledge agreement, just a definition. That's right on the state exam. Hard money is sometimes called a cash loan. It's more complicated than that. If I buy a house and Bank of America makes a purchase money loan, is that a hard money loan? And the answer is, yeah, depending on which definition you want to use. If you use the California Civil Code definition of hard money, it's a hard money loan because Bank of America actually has to put money into escrow, as opposed to a seller giving credit. That's soft money. So if I'm selling you my property and I'm giving you, it's called a carryback, a $800,000 loan, I don't have to put $800,000 into escrow. I just give you credit. That's soft. Other loans are hard. If a borrower defaults on the first trust deed, the holder of a junior trust deed could reinstate and then do a sale. This rarely happens, but you could do that. If a lender accepts a deed in lieu of foreclosure, the lender is obligated for any junior liens. Remember that, I'm not gonna go back, that timeline, right? The deed in lieu of foreclosure. A purchase money loan takes priority over any liens against the purchaser that exist at the time of the purchase. Let's say 10 years ago, I had been sued and there was a judgment against me. Make it 9 years ago, I'm sued and there's a judgment against me. And I buy a house today and the lender doesn't know about this existing lawsuit. Well, I just now own a new house, and then the guy that I owe money to for 9 years finds out I just have a new house and comes up and says, oh, you got a new house, I want it, you owe me money. The problem with that is that the lender who lent me the money made a purchase money loan, a loan to buy the property being secured by the property being bought, and that loan has priority over other debts that I just might have. Trustees aren't controlled by anybody. You should get the beneficiary. Remember, on the state exam, they're going to not say lender and borrower as much. They're going to say trustor, beneficiary. A beneficiary is a lender. Mortgages and trust deeds differ in the number of parties involved, the statute of limitations, and the transfer of title. So in a mortgage, there's two parties, the mortgagor, the mortgagee, and the trustee. There's three, trustor, trustee, and a beneficiary. There's a statute of limitations on a mortgage of 4 years. There's no statute of limitations in a trust deed. And the mortgage does not constitute a transfer of title, whereas the trust deed, I mean, it's got the word deed in its name. That would imply that title is moving in its legal title. The phrase carryback, some people find that a strange phrase, but a carryback is when a seller takes back a trust deed or mortgage as partial payment and it has a lien. So in the old days, and this might come back again depending on where interest rates go, there were loans called an 80-10-10. I mean, we still have 80-10-10, but back in the old days, the 80-10-10 was you would get an 80% loan from a lender you've heard of. And then the seller would give the buyer a 10% short-term loan. so that the buyer didn't need to have as much of a down payment, only 10% instead of 20. So the buyer would have more money, maybe they could buy down their interest rate. And that would mean that instead of getting 10% of the sales price, the seller is getting a piece of paper saying that they're owed that. The relationship is similar to a beneficiary to a trustor. Remember, beneficiaries are lenders, trustors are borrowers. The junior, any lien that's not a first is a junior lien. You can have a second, you can have a third, you can have a fourth. There's no limit. There is no limit. Priority is established by recording. The risk gets higher. The first gets paid first, the second gets paid second, third, you get the idea. If you're 10th, chances are you're not going to get anything. Basic protection is the borrower's equity, right? If the borrower has enough equity, then it's safe. Generally speaking, lenders basically, lenders assume that if they have to take you to foreclosure, they're going to lose 20% just because of that process, right? Because people do not go to the courthouse steps in order to bid the highest price possible. They go there to get a bargain. So that's why if you have 20% down, you have better terms than if you have 10% down. But if you have 30% down or 50% down, lenders are even happier because now the chances that they're going to lose money is slim to none. So it's the amount of equity that's in the property that creates a buffer so that you could foreclose. The beneficiary of the loan would record a request for notice of default. That's a document that would, especially if it's a junior loan, that would let them know if there is something happening on the first. All right, all-inclusive trustees. All-inclusive trustees, also known as a wraparound, hold harmless, overriding. This is a great line. It's a trust deed which is subordinate to, yet includes the liens to which it is subordinated. Yeah, think about that for a moment. Subordinate to, but includes the liens to which, So this used to be a big deal, well, a long time ago, when it was called creative financing. Interest rates in the United States and in California at one point crossed 16–17%. Now you think 5 is high. Try 15% interest. So people were getting, they called it creative in ways of financing property. A few years ago, somebody who'd gone through my real estate school that was working at the office where I was their mentor came to me and said that his son wanted to buy a property in San Diego, a condominium at the Hard Rock Hotel. And he was confused. The father said, well, I got my real estate license. Let me look at the paperwork. And he's looking at the father said, I have no idea. I'm confused about this paperwork. And he asked me if I would look at it. And he puts the papers in front of me and I'm looking at it. And right at the top of the first page, it says all-inclusive trust deed. And I was like, whoa, been a long time since I've seen one of these. Now, what was going on is that his son, who was a rugby star in Japan. Now, the sons, they're not Japanese, right? They're not Japanese citizens, but apparently, I did not know this, Japan had a relatively robust rugby league, and his son was a professional rugby player, and his income came not just from playing rugby, but from endorsements in Japan. Now, this is the issue. Let's say you're a typical lender in San Diego, and you're looking at a borrower whose all their income is advertising, endorsements, and playing rugby in Japan. That's it. No income in the United States. Very little that you can even verify. I mean, they're saying hard to get a loan. But the guy was like 6'7" and with shoulder length red hair. And for some reason, the people that owned the Hard Rock Hotel, the one that owned the condominium, they wanted him to buy there. And so what they did is he had, by the way, a down payment, but nobody in the United States would give him a loan. But they said, we'll give you a loan. A seller carry bank, we'll give you the loan. The issue is, this is why it's an all-inclusive, is that there was already a loan on the condo. Let's say the condo was worth $500,000. And the existing loan was about $300,000, which means they had $200,000 in equity. The existing loan is 5% interest. So what the owner of the condominium at the Hard Rock Hotel said is, you got 50 grand, that's cool. We're going to lend you $450,000. Now, at 7% interest, but we'll lend you the money. Now, this is where it gets a little weird, if it's not weird already. That $450,000 all-inclusive trust deed is a second, right? Because this one over here is the first. It's a second. So what they really did, they took the $300,000 that they already owed at 5%, and they kind of sort of relent that $300,000 to this guy and bumped up the interest rate a couple of points and then threw in a little bit extra. So, and I said, you might want to talk to a lawyer because, there are implications of doing this. And he said the kid wants to buy the property and, it's all right, so buy the property. So this is it's a trust deed that is subordinate to, right? So this is the second. It is subordinate to the first, but it includes the liens to which it is subordinated. The reason they call it a wrap is that it wraps around the property. That's the metaphor. So when you make payments on your all-inclusive trust deed, they have to make payments on the underlying loan. Listen. The blanket trust deed or mortgage is when more than one parcel is being used. When a single one does not constitute security, it would have a partial release clause. And the equity goes up over time. I have an example, sort of. I have an example. Let's say a subdivider is subdividing. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. 24. So the subdivider wants to subdivide a parcel into 24 lots. So the subdivider has, gotten the map approved for the 24 lots. And now the subdivider wants to build 24 houses. Now let's say, so the construction loan isn't going, there's not going to be 24 construction loans. In other words, the construction lender isn't going to lend, money on this one and then money on that one. And that's not the way they do it. They make one big loan. Let's say it's $12 million, just $12 million. That $12 million loan is a blanket loan in that it blankets all of the properties that are in the subdivision. So now all the houses are built. You want to buy this one. There's a problem. And the problem is there's already a $12 million loan that property is the security for. So when you go to the bank to say, hey, I need $500,000 to buy this house, and the bank says, well, you got to be kidding. There's a $12 million first on this house. There's no way we're going to lend you $500,000 as a second. It's not going to happen. So in order for you to get a loan to buy that property, we're going to have to make a hole in the blanket, right? There's going to have to be a hole made in the blanket. And the way you make a hole in the blanket is through that partial release clause, which would release that property from the blanket encumbrance. This blanket encumbrance Is it a general lien or is it a specific lien? The blanket encumbrance, is it a general lien or is it a specific lien? And the answer is it's a specific lien. It's on more than one parcel, but it's specified what those parcels are. It's on more than one parcel, but we know which way. If the subdivider owned other property in another area, it's not going to be a lien on that. Property taxes cannot be a blanket encumbrance. They can only be on the property that you owe the taxes. Miscellaneous stuff. A package mortgage is when you use real and personal property as security for a loan. There was something called the dot-com bust in the early 2000s. And there was all these tech companies that crashed and burned, right? Petopia, Webvan, companies are not around anymore. But what was happening is in the buildup, venture capital was flowing freely. And so what some of the tech companies in Silicon Valley had done is they were, they're flying people in from Hong Kong and Europe and things like that. And they realized that putting them up in the hotel was costing a lot of money. And so they thought, hey, California Real Estate, let's invest. So what they did is they took some of the venture capital money and they bought condos and townhomes in Silicon Valley and furnished them. So that when the engineer from Hong Kong came, they would put them in the townhouse it's already furnished, rather than having them stay in a hotel for the month or two or whatever time period they were there. Well, then their stock crashed, became worthless, and all of a sudden, the market was flooded with fully furnished condominiums and townhomes in Silicon Valley. And they wanted to sell everything, right? Well, you could do that. There are lenders that would say, we'll lend you money, not only to buy the real estate, but also to buy the furniture that's in it as well. A fictitious trustee or mortgage is it's basically all of the clauses, the whereases, the where-tos, and all that other kind of stuff. It costs money to record each page. So they take the big, thick, sample form, I guess, record it one time. It's said to be fictitious because it's not really a mortgage or a trustee on any particular property. It's just got all the words in it. And then when you buy the property, they give you a printed copy for your records, but they give you a short form. That's all they record, so that they don't have to spend money on every page to record it. Chattel means personal property. A chattel mortgage is when personal property is the security for a debt. It's also called a security agreement if you're using the new term, but sometimes the Department of Real Estate asks about chattel mortgage. Remember, a pledge, mortgage, to pawn is when the borrower gives up use and possession of the property. We'll talk more about that. Hypothecate is a really fun word. It comes from two Greek words, hypo, which means under, like hypodermic, goes under the skin, and thecate, which is another, but Greek this time, word that means to pledge or pawn, which means the borrower does not give up use and possession of the property. It's the same as mortgage. Assignment by a lender, if the lender assigns a debt, it's called subrogation. So the subrogation is when you're substituting who the money is owed to. So Bank of America says, we're going to sell your loan to Wells Fargo, which they don't do, but could, right? They usually sell them to other people you've never heard of. That's called subrogation, just a word that appears on the state exam. Transfer of property by the borrower, you can either assume or take something subject to. And you could assume or take something subject to. If you assume a debt, the buyer is primarily liable for a deficiency judgment, and the seller is secondarily liable unless there's a substitution of liability. There's an assumption fee that's usually involved whenever you do that. If a buyer takes property and assumes the debt, the buyer is primarily liable. If a buyer takes property subject to the debt, the buyer cannot be held liable. So let's look at some more charts. Assumption. A lender makes a loan. So we have the use of the money, we have the payment of principal and interest. The owner of the property decides to sell the property, becomes a seller, finds a buyer, deeds the property to the buyer. There's an assumption agreement that everybody signs. The lender signs it, the borrower, seller signs it, the buyer signs it, everybody signs it. That gives the buyer essentially the use of the money. That's whatever is remaining in the loan. And the buyer would give the seller whatever equity is in the property. Now, the question is, what if the property was foreclosed and there was a deficiency and there was a deficiency judgment? Who would be primarily responsible? And the answer is the buyer, because the buyer has said they signed an assumption agreement that said they're assuming personal responsibility, but the seller is secondarily liable. So in assumption, primary responsibility transfers to the buyer. Seller is secondarily liable. Now, if the property was sold subject to, the first part is the same: the lender, the loan, principal and interest. Borrower becomes a seller, deeds the property to a buyer, they get the use of the money, they pay the equity. But notice what's missing: there's no assumption agreement. The buyer has never signed a document saying that they're taking personal responsibility for the loan. So if there was a foreclosure and there was a deficiency and it was subject to, the buyer is not personally responsible for the loan. Now, you might be saying, why would anybody do this? Why are you talking about it? When is it done? It's not done. Neither of these are done. Right? The only properties really that are out there that you could have a loan that you could assume is an FHA loan. There's very few, virtually no assumptions are subject to. This is just something that you find in real estate textbooks, such that the Department of Real Estate is motivated to ask questions about. The real property conditional installment sales contract, known affectionately as land contracts. And in a land contract, what we're really talking about is security, and security means collateral. And collateral is two words, both Latin. The word col, which means along, and the word lateral, which means to the side. So collateral is something alongside of something else. There are, generally speaking, two ways of doing this: possession or title. Let's look at an example: the pawn shop. Let's say I go into a pawnbroker and I tell the pawnbroker I need $500. And the pawnbroker says, okay, what do you got in security? And let's say I have a really expensive watch. So I show the pawnbroker my watch. The pawnbroker is looking at the watch. The pawnbroker is saying, yeah, that looks good. It looks like it's worth a lot more than $500. So the pawnbroker is going to give me the $500, but the pawnbroker is going to make me sign a note, an IOU, that says I promise to pay back the $500 in 3 months plus, 15, 20, 30% interest, whatever. Is that all the pawnbroker wants before he gives me the money? My signature on the promissory note, is that it? Or does the pawnbroker want something else? And the answer is the pawnbroker wants the watch. How about if I promise to take really good care of the watch, and then I'll give it to the pawnbroker if I can't make the payments? That probably won't work. How about this? This watch is my calendar, my computer, it's everything. If I don't have the watch, I won't even know what day it is. I won't even know when to pay you back. They're going to take the watch. You understand, alongside of my promise to pay back the $500, they want the watch. So possession of the item that is being used as security is in the hands of the lender. But it's still my watch. At that moment, that watch does not belong, the pawnbroker isn't allowed to wear the watch. It's my watch. But the pawnbroker has possession of it, just so I don't forget to pay him back the $500. The land contract is the flip side of that. And again, it's like buying a car and financing it through the bank. If you buy a car and you finance it through the bank, whose car is it? Is it yours or is it the bank's? Now, a lot of people say, well, it's the bank's car. Excuse me. It's the bank's car. They got the pink slip. Really? So you're driving your car and the car is making a funny noise and rattling. It's louder and louder, and you see smoke coming out of the hood and flames are leaping out of the hood, and you jump out of the car and you make it to the sidewalk just as the car bursts into fire. What would you do? Call the bank. Is this not what you do? You'd call the bank and say, hey, you better come and get your car. It's causing a big traffic jam and it's on fire. They're not going to come and get it. How about this? You have a convertible, right? And the bank manager wants to take the family on a picnic to the beach, right? On the weekend, because it's going to be a nice day. And they're figuring, hey, driving a convertible to the beach would be a lot more fun. So you get this message on your phone, and it's the bank manager. And the bank manager is saying, hey, this Saturday, we're gonna have a picnic on the beach, and we've decided we want to take the convertible. So I'll be dropping by at 10 o'clock Saturday morning to pick up our car. Can they do that? Can the bank manager come and take your car for a drive or something like that? The answer is no. It's your car. The bank holding on to the pink slip is not a sign of ownership. It's just security for a loan. Because if you don't make the payments, they're going to send two guys at midnight to go get the car. And once they've got the car and the pink slip and you're in default, they could sell the car. The land contract is the same thing, where I have a document. We'll get to it in a second. It's the same idea. So land contract is an instrument. That means it's a piece of paper. Seller agrees to convey title after the buyer has met certain conditions, like paid. It's called an installment sales contract, an agreement to convey, agreement for purchase, land contract. It is a finance instrument. So it's a way of buying property where you don't have a mortgage or you don't have a trustee. It's a deferred payment. You don't pay all the money up front, you make payment over time. It's a security device. Remember collateral, where the seller, who's called the vendor, extends credit to a buyer who's called the vendee. The vendee is the equitable owner and has what's called equitable title, which is use in possession. Vendor holds the legal title. And from a financing standpoint, the vendee and the vendor's relationship is like a trustor and a beneficiary. All right. So let's look at a land contract. The vendor, the seller, and the lender. Land contracts are seller financing. It's a way for the seller to finance the purchase. So the vendor, seller, lender has a land contract with the vendee, buyer, borrower. The vendee, buyer, borrower agrees to pay principal and interest, and they get possession, equitable title. Equitable title means it's your car, or in this case, your house. If the property goes up in value, it's your win if you're the vendee, buyer, borrower. If it goes down in value, it's your loss. Can the vendor, seller, lender spend the weekend in your guest room, have their kids come over to play in your swimming pool when it's hot in the summer? And the answer is no. The seller, the vendor, the lender has the pink slip to the property, but you have the equitable title if you're the vendee, buyer, borrower. Now, if you're the vendee, buyer, borrower, what you would be worried about is what happens if the vendor, seller, lender were to transfer the title, lose the title, move the title while you're in the process of making the payments. So what you would want to do if you're the vendee buyer borrower is you'd want to nail your land contract against the seller's title. And the way we nail something against somebody's title is through recording. Is everybody with me? Right? The buyer is going to record the land contract, nails it to the seller's title. Now it doesn't matter if the seller's title moves around, doesn't matter, because you nailed it to the title. But here's the disadvantage from the point of view of the vendor. What if the vendee defaults on the payment, stops making the payment, stops returning phone calls, and abandons the property? You would like to sell the property to somebody else, but you've got a problem. And the problem is you've got this thing nailed to your title. The only way you're going to be able to sell the property to anybody else is that if you can pull that nail and get it off your title. There's only two ways of doing that. One way is a quit claim deed. That's where the vendee, the buyer, signs a piece of paper that says, I give up, I quit all claims I have to the property. That would pull the nail. Back in the day when land contracts were used more often, vendees would say, give me $5,000 and I'll sign your quitclaim deed. Vendors were incensed because this is somebody that owes them money. What do you mean give him $5,000? He owes me more than that. I'm going to say, right, yeah. And usually they ended up giving the $5,000 to the vendee to sign the quitclaim deed. Why? And that's because what's option number 2? Right? Option number 1, get the vendee to sign the quitclaim deed. What's option number 2? Hire a lawyer. File a complaint, get a hearing, win the hearing, get a judgment, take the judgment and record the judgment. Now that process is called a quiet title action. You understand how long is 5,000 going to last when you hire a lawyer to go to court? This is all, we don't do this very often, but that's the only 2 ways of removing, other than paying you off the loan, the only 2 ways of removing the land contract. If the vendor assigns a contract, title must also be conveyed. Vendors can borrow money on the property, but cannot borrow more than the equity they have in the property. They have to use any payments they get to make payments. In other words, when the vendee makes payments to the vendor has to make payments on their loan. If the vendee defaults, the vendor would issue a quiet title suit or obtain a quitclaim deed, or there would be a cloud on title, which I graphically illustrated with a big cloud. Vendee can record the contract. They always do. Vendor cannot keep them from recording. Vendor cannot waive the right. Both of them have to sign and acknowledge. Acknowledge means signing in the presence of a notary in order to be recorded, which is what the next line says. Vendee may prepay the contract. If there's impounds, impounds are for property taxes, insurance, homeowner association fees, must be held in trust. A land contract differs from a deed with respect to the interest conveyed. A deed conveys legal title. A land contract conveys equitable title. Signature of the parties. A deed would be signed by the grantor only, but a land contract would be signed by the vendor and the vendee. And designation of the purchase price, a deed does not have to have a price in it. They usually don't. But a land contract would have to have the price because you have to know what you're paying. The advantage would be minimum down payment. We don't do these hardly ever anymore, but anyhow, it's on the state exam. The disadvantage, this is not a really good way to buy a house. Vendors could die, right? Forcing you to get a lawyer and sue the estate. So comparisons of mortgages, trust deeds, and land contracts. The mortgage, there's a note to the lender and then a mortgage to the lender. In a trust deed, there's a note to the lender and a deed of trust to the trustee. In a land contract, there's a contract between the vendor and the vendee. If there's a default, it's judicial foreclosure for a mortgage, trustee sale for the trust deed, but judicial foreclosure, that's you have to To throw the person out requires a court. And if you've paid off the mortgage, you get a certificate of discharge. If you've paid off the trustee, you get a deed of reconveyance. And if you've paid off your land contract, you get a deed to the property. We're going to finish by discussing involuntary liens, which are liens that you didn't consent to. And whenever you're closing a transaction, the escrow company is going to be concerned about all of these: tax liens, state liens, EDD liens, county tax liens. All of these are forms of tax liens. They all have a 10-year duration. Like judgments, these liens are blanket liens and attach themselves to all property belonging to the delinquent taxpayer. Federal tax liens, state, not county, not property tax liens, but the federal tax liens and other liens that you owe to the state. Types of liens to attach to a specific property: the mechanics lien, the list pendants, homeowner association liens. They're all specific to the property. Mechanics liens are when a contractor hasn't been paid. Its duration is 90 days from the date recorded. We're going to cover that a little bit later. The list pendants is a notice of a court action. We're going to cover that later. Homeowners liens are when you don't owe your homeowner association dues. They last until you pay them off. And substandard liens, if you owe money because your weeds are all over the place and things like that, that's going to have to be paid off as well. So involuntary liens. There's a mechanics lien, a judgment, a list pendants, the attachment, and property taxes, special assessments, and income taxes, which we're going to talk about later. Mechanics liens. Now, you think of a mechanic as somebody that, fixes your car, maybe, that sort of thing, but we're talking a lot more. It's just an old-fashioned word. It means anyone who provides labor, services, equipment, or material toward an improvement on real property. PG&E that turns on the power, the lumber yard that delivers the lumber, the company that pours the concrete, the contractor, subcontractors, all of those people are included in this. It's a special remedy because usually you have to go to court to get a judgment before you can lien somebody's property. However, a mechanics lien can be recorded against the property before the person entitled to the lien goes to court. This is in the California State Constitution that says that somebody who's provided a work of improvement on real property has a right to file a lien against the property if they're not paid. And it must be verified and recorded. Verified means you have to sign under penalty of perjury that this is in fact true if you're the contractor, and it has to be recorded, and it's a specific lien. The notice of non-responsibility. If you've ever been like in a downtown area and you see work going on in the building and you see these little pieces of paper, taped on the outside of the building, and you're bored, right? And so you go over to read what the little pieces of paper say. A lot of times they're notices of non-responsibility. And what's going on here is a tenant is having work done on the property. And what the owner of the property is concerned about is what if the tenant doesn't pay the contractor and the contractor files a mechanics lien against the property of the owner, and the owner never wanted the work done in the first place. So what the notice of non-responsibility does is it gives notice to the workers, to the contractor, that you can't file a mechanics lien because the owner didn't authorize the work, a tenant did. The owner must post on the premises and record a notice of non-responsibility within 10 days of the work. Priority. Mechanics liens have priority over other liens except for taxes and assessments, which attach subsequent, that means after the work of improvement was begun or materials were first furnished. And a very common question has to do with the security of a trust deed might be impaired if it was recorded after a construction project began. So work starts on a construction project. A trust deed is recorded. If a mechanics lien is later recorded, the mechanics lien relates back in time to the day the work began. So even though the trust deed is recorded before the mechanics lien has priority because the work began earlier. All mechanics liens date back to the beginning of the scheme of improvement. All of them do. Well, what about people that worked in the middle of the project? The person who put in the hardwood floors. All mechanics liens date back to the beginning of the work of improvement. Well, what about the contractors who worked at the very end, who just put the trim and fit? All mechanics liens date back to the beginning of the work of improvement. And one of the most common on the state exam examples of the beginning of the work of improvement is lumber being delivered. Right, so there's questions on the state exam that say lumber is delivered on this day, a mortgage is signed on this day, the mechanics lien is recorded, which takes priority. Well, the mechanics lien does because lumber being delivered is part of the beginning of the work of improvement. What is completion? Well, there's something called a notice of completion, which you could record, and that would say you're done. Or if they stopped working for 60 days, or they stopped working for 30 days and you recorded a notice of cessation. I've had people say to me, I don't understand why you're talking, why notices completion and cessation, and don't you know when the contractor is done? And when somebody asks me that, my reaction is, you haven't worked with that many contractors, have you? Sometimes it's hard to tell if they're done or not. So you could just say you're done and record a notice of completion. What's the advantage of that? If you record the notice of completion, then the general contractor has 60 days after recording to file a mechanics lien. All others have 30. If the notice of completion is not recorded, everybody has 90 days. The lis pendens is a notice of a pending lawsuit. That's what a lis pendens is. And it must be recorded, and recording gives constructive notice. That's something we're going to talk about in another class. It is effective until the judgment has been rendered or it's dismissed. Right? It may affect title depending on the outcome of the lawsuit. So how long would it take to get somebody into a court? Months? Years? So let's say you sue me and I'm like, well, I'm just going to sell everything I got and get out of town before you can sue me. You could record a lis pendens, which would make it impossible really for me to sell the property because anybody that bought it would be buying it subject to the eventual lawsuit. An attachment lien is when it's ramped up another notch. And this is when property is seized by court order and then held as security. It's valid for 3 years. So if they think that you're about to sell everything and leave the country or something like that, they can attach the property, especially if you look really guilty. And anyhow, they can attach the property until the judgment. Speaking of a judgment, it's the final determination of the rights of the parties in a court action. An abstract of judgment is recorded, and that creates a general involuntary lien upon the property of the debtor. It is valid for 10 years. There's a lot of different kinds of judgments. Money judgments, child support judgments, spousal support judgments. Usually a money judgment can be extended for an additional 10 years, but usually it's good for 10 years. And then there's something called an execution, which is a writ of execution, which is a court ordering an official to sell the property. Let me give you an example about judgments, writ of execution. I had a guy that wanted to sell land. It was in Redwood City, vacant land. I listed it. I opened escrow. Escrow company ran a preliminary title report. I read it. There was nothing nothing to note, looked like all the other ones, you know, in that particular area. There's no liens that were weird, nothing. It was nice and clean. And so anyhow, I'm marketing the property, and a few weeks go by, and the title company calls me up, and the title company says, that land that you listed in Redwood City, did you know that the owner of the property has a judgment against him? I said, no, I did not know that. Well, apparently, 5 years before, down in San Diego, he had a business. The business failed, and his business partner sued him. And the business partner won, and the business partner got a judgment against him. Now, you can record a judgment in every county. And in fact, usually if you get a judgment against somebody, you record it in every county in California because you may not know where they own stuff. And if you do record it, it eventually liens the property that they own. So I called the guy up and I said, did you know about the judgment 5 years ago? And he said, yeah, San Diego, so what? And I said, well, your business partner's lawyer recorded the judgment in every county probably, including San Mateo County where, you know, Redwood City is. So then the guy said to me, well, what does it mean? You know, what does this mean that there's a judgment? You know, well, how's that going to affect me selling it? And I said, well, what it means is that when you sell the property, you're going to have to pay off the judgment from the money you raised from selling the land. Now, I'm not going to repeat the exact words he used, but let's just say he expressed a disinterest in his previous business partner getting any money. So then he asked me a question, which would be very common on the state exam. And the question he asked me was, how long is a judgment good for? I said, 10 years. He said, I'll wait. I'll just wait. It's been 5 years. I don't have to sell the land. I can wait another 5 years. So one point from that story is just because you get a judgment against somebody does not mean you're getting any money, right? It means you created a lien for 10 years, but if they don't sell in 10 years, you still don't have any money. And you can get it extended. Sometimes it's hard to get it extended unless you can show that the person is hiding from you and that you made a really good effort to try and find stuff. So if the business partner down in San Diego had found out that he owned land in Redwood City, the lawyer could have come to San Mateo County and asked the court for a writ of execution. Now, the word writ means court order, and the word execute means carry out. So a writ of execution is when the court orders the property to be sold in order to satisfy a judgment. That's the writ of execution. All right. That ends all that I have for tonight. If this is one of your first classes, or you want to hear how, you know, the program works, stick around, right? Because I'm going to maybe cover that. So if you're in the process, the way you get started to get a real estate license is you have to do 3 things. You have to complete 3 college level courses in real estate. Don't have to go to college. My package includes all of that. You have to pass the state exam, and then you can apply for a license. The 3 college courses, one has to be real estate principles, one has to be real estate practice, and the third one is an elective, which can come from anything on this list. We've included legal aspects of real estate in our package, but any of these, if you've taken them, would qualify as the third course. You need to have 135 hours of pre-license training to take the state exam, 45 hours of principles, practice, and legal aspects. And I'm affiliated with a company that's approved by the California Department of Real Estate to do this and issue you the certificates of completion that you need. And all of the testing and grading and all of that is done online, including the final exams. So there's 3 college courses, so there's 3 final exams. The final exams are online final exams. You can take them at home, and they're an open book test. Let me cover that one more time. 3 college courses, 3 final exams, online, at home, open book. You can cheat as much as you want to. Final exams, you can cheat as much as you want to. They give you 3 hours to get 75 out of 100 questions correct. Did I mention that this is an open book test? So this is not the hard part of getting a real estate license. In fact, the Department of Real Estate makes you wait 18 days from when you start one of the courses before you can take the final exam. Why? You don't have to take the final exam in 18 days. You just can't take the final exam any sooner than 18 days. And the reason they make you wait 18 days is it's supposed to be a 45-hour course, but you could pass tonight. We give you the textbook and an internet connection, and you can phone friends. You could look up 75 answers in 3 hours, which would make the whole 45-hour thing seem kind of ridiculous. This is not the hard part of getting a real estate license. Online, open book, cheat as much as you want to, college courses. Hard part is passing the state exam. It's 3 hours with 150 multiple guess questions. It's not an online at-home test. You got to physically go to one of the Department of Real Estate testing sites, Fresno, San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, really, Oakland or Sacramento. You need to get 70% of the questions right in order to pass, which if you think about it is not a particularly high score. I would hope my brain surgeon did better than 70% on the brain surgeon's exam, but apparently you don't have to be a brain surgeon to get a real estate license. Having said that, however, still over half the people that take the test fail it. All of the people that are, and by the way, many have failed before. You can take the test an unlimited number of times. All of the people that are failing have completed the 3 college level courses in real estate. They all have, because they won't let you take the test without doing the 3 college courses, which is why I would say that doing the 3 college courses does not mean you're getting a real estate license. It just means you've done the minimum amount necessary to go take a shot at the exam. What I do is I teach people how to pass the test. I have live classes Wednesday nights, focused on what you need to know to pass the exam, broadcast and record it. They're like a pizza, warm and cheesy, and they're in a rotating, there's no first slice. Right, they're all independent modules. You can start with any one. You can take them in any order. It just keeps going on and on and on and on. The investment in the whole program is $398. That gives you the 12 live classes, video replays, course outline, practice testing, college level courses, and a Saturday cram class. I have good reviews, high pass rates. I'm focused on the California test, where California writes their own questions. I also have a placement program and a rebate program. I work with eXp Realty. We're a cloud-based brokerage, and I have a team of agents all up and down the state of California. How long does it take? 18 days minimum to finish each of the college courses. I would make it 54. Then you could apply to get an exam date. That's going to take 4 to 6 weeks. While you're waiting, your fingerprint processing would begin, which is 6 weeks. Once you've passed the state exam, it takes at least 2 weeks usually to get a license. 4 to 6 months from beginning to end is what it takes typically. What does it cost? Well, the college level license plate is $398, state exam is $305, fingerprint and processing is $75, $778 gets you in the door. Other fees you might have, these are annual, is the Board of Realtors, about $700 a year. Multiple listing service, a little bit more. Those are annual numbers. And by the way, our average commission is well over $20,000. Just thought I would share that. Your license is good for 4 years, and every 4 years you have to renew it for $245. If you wanted to sign up now, and who wouldn't, you go to my website, dreclass.com, click on the sign up now button. If you're just beginning the journey, you take the first option, the license prep and college courses. If you're taking the state exam soon, you would just do the workshop. If you've taken your college courses a really long time ago, or you need more than just the workshop and a brush up, you would take the middle option. If you've got any questions, reach out to us. Make an appointment to talk to me if you would like. I'm using my calendar link. call the office, send us an email. Love to talk to you. That's all I got. Thanks for everything. Stay safe out there. Any questions, reach out to me. Have a great evening.